Late night bites with friends? Already hard to beat. That first too hot bite of fries you couldn't wait for, followed by ice-cold Pepsi. Now that hits different. Suddenly, the energy kicks back in, the night goes longer, and the laughs don't stop. Because Pepsi brings out more flavor, more fun, and more of the moment. Food deserves Pepsi. Grab a Pepsi Zero Sugar today.
Hello?
Look what TJ Maxx dragged in.
The Devil Wears Prada 2 is now streaming on Disney Plus and Hulu.
We are digital, we are downloadable, we are streamable.
The fashion event of the year is certified fresh.
Pull yourself together, we have work to do.
Critics say it's smart and witty and the perfect sequel.
That's all.
Get runway ready for The Devil Wears Prada 2 on Disney Plus and Hulu. Rated PG-13.
Hi everyone, this is Scott. For maps, references, and images for each episode, as well as links to all my social media, please go to ancientworldpodcast.com. And if you'd like to support the show, please go to patreon.com/theancientworld. Thanks again for listening. The default lifestyle for the vast majority of human existence was simple hunter-gatherer. I mean, you can substitute fisher for hunter, and forager sounds more active than gatherer, but really we're just splitting hairs. So Homo sapiens was also Homo venans frumentator. In much the same way, the default mode of human transport was walking. Or running if you were excited or scared. You could also swim, I guess, or maybe learn to stand on a log or tie some together to make a crude raft. So maybe Homo ambulans fluitans as well. And so things passed for Homo sapiens for hundreds of thousands of years. Interestingly, as far as we can tell, the first big step changes in transport and sustenance took place at roughly the same time. The oldest known boat, a canoe or dugout, has been dated to roughly 8,000 BC. And in the same millennium, the Fertile Crescent became a test case for a brand new human lifestyle. Whether humans domesticated animals and crops, or conversely became domesticated by them, is a fun and interesting debate. But some facts are fairly straightforward. Per Laura Spinney, the set of practices we call farming came together over a long period of time in different places, mostly through trial and error. Hunter-gatherers in the Zagros Mountains learned to grow wheat and barley. They were also the first to domesticate the goat, which, unbeknownst to me, was only the second animal after the dog to be domesticated. Meanwhile, in Anatolia, other hunter-gatherers started penning sheep and cultivating chickpeas and lentils. Before too long, the wild ox, or aurochs, joined the domestic herd. But per Spinney, farming became a true revolution when its early practitioners pulled up stakes and took their show on the road. While the Anatolian farmer-herders spread west across the Dardanelles into Thrace, their Iranian counterparts expanded east across the Iranian plateau, in the direction of Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. They also spread north toward and over or around the Caucasus Mountains, which in the early 6th millennium BC brought them to their first encounter with the lands of the Northern Steppe. Per Warwick Ball, the Northern Steppe, or Eurasian Steppe, is a belt of temperate grasslands stretching all the way from Hungary to Manchuria, a distance of some 4,300 miles. The term steppe is equivalent to the North American prairie, or South American pampas, or African savanna. It characterizes regions too dry to support a forest or cultivate a crop, but not quite dry enough to be a desert. The Eurasian steppe is distinguished by both its enormous expanse and the bitter cold of its winters. Despite the inhospitable environment, many ancient hunter-gatherers made the steppe their home, sticking pretty close to its numerous river valleys. Per Spinney, as the settlements of the Iranian farmer-herders started dotting the foothills of the North Caucasus with their bounteous crops and large domesticated herds, the neighboring steppe tribes started to take notice. They eventually adopted the only element that actually worked for them: herding. One benefit to keeping domesticated animals was their ability to process the steppe's main resource, grass, into a variety of useful products. At first, steppe tribes only kept small herds, mainly for ritual sacrifice, while they continued to live off hunting and fishing. But in time, herds became larger and also more valued as a source of food and textiles. Actually, the northern steppe tribes may have been introduced to herding at about the same time from two completely different sources. The first, which we just discussed, were the descendants of the Iranian farmer-herders who'd populated the North Caucasus foothills. The second were the descendants of their Anatolian counterparts who'd settled in Eastern Europe, in the form of a farming-herding culture known as the Kris. Per David W. Anthony, the Kris had originated west of the Carpathian Mountains before migrating through and around the mountains to approach the northern steppe. Their culture was characterized by female-centered domestic cults and little evidence of hierarchy. Two important things they brought with them, entirely novel to the local steppe dwellers, were small-scale farming and large domesticated herds. In fact, their arrival along the Dniester River around 5800 BC introduced the first breeds of domesticated sheep, cattle, wheat, and barley the region had ever encountered. The local hunter-gatherers were known as the Bug-Dniester culture, named for two rivers flowing into the northwest corner of the Black Sea. Both river valleys were heavily forested, with plenty of animals to hunt and wood to burn and build with. Which is to say, for hunter-gatherers, they had a pretty sweet setup. Despite this, the evidence shows that soon after their arrival, aspects of the Kris farming-herding culture began to be adopted by the Bug-Dniester hunter-gatherer culture. Per Anthony, over the centuries that followed, the Bug-Dniester diet contained an increasing proportion of domesticated cattle compared to their previous staple of local wild deer. Like with the Iranian farmer-herders of the North Caucasus foothills, the adoption of herding was mostly confined to the frontier region between the two neighboring cultures, with minimal penetration further into the steppe. Which is how things stayed for 600 years until, around 5200 BC, a new wave of Western farmer-herders appeared at the edge of the steppe. The Cucuteni-Tripolye culture, or CTC, had originated near the lower Danube River before migrating northeast to cross the Dniester Valley frontier. Over the centuries that followed, the culture penetrated further eastward, crossing the South Bug River Valley and advancing on the Dnieper, all the while absorbing or driving off the previous steppe inhabitants. Per Anthony, like the Kris before them, the CTC possessed a farming-herding culture, female-centered domestic cults, and little evidence of hierarchy. And again, herding was the only part of this mix that steppe tribes were happy to adopt. As they did so, herding began to spread further eastward, much faster than the CTC advance. By the time it reached the Volga-Ural region, around 4600 BC, herding had become the default lifestyle in the entire region north of the Black and Caspian Seas, known as the Pontic-Caspian Steppe. Why do we think this happened? Well, per the author, it all came down to the big fat juicy herds of the CTC. And vegan listeners may want to cover their ears. So, not only was that meat just really, really tasty, ask Odysseus's men, right? But the herds allowed the CTC to throw huge feasts for festivals, weddings, funerals, what have you, which was a pretty mind-blowing thing to witness. To put it in perspective, hunting and gathering rarely involved food storage, let alone hoarding or conspicuous consumption. On the upside, this had led to a relatively egalitarian steppe society with little concentrated wealth. But once keeping big fat juicy herds became an option, it was processed through the largely male-centric and patriarchal steppe society to give rise to something entirely new. The first local culture to reflect the change was based in the Dnieper and Donets river valleys north of the Black Sea, and is known as the Dnieper-Donets II or DD2 culture. Where previous steppe cultures, as well as the CTC, typically left their dead above ground for exposure to birds and other wild animals, the DD2 gathered the bones of their dead for burial in communal pits, which, lucky for us, preserved a treasure trove of valuable information. Per Anthony, the most striking aspect of DD2 burials were A, the profusion of new decorations for the human body, and B, the clear inequality in their distribution. While most individuals were buried with simple stone beads or animal bones, a small number were buried with thousands of shell beads, bird bone tubes, ornaments of copper, gold, crystal, and porphyry, and ornamental plaques made of boar tusk. These finds mark the appearance of a brand new figure, the tribal chief of the steppe. Per the author, the emergence of the first steppe chiefdoms in the period between 5200 and 5000 BC reflected a new cultural orientation toward the acquisition and control of large herds of cattle, which had one predictable outcome. Per Spinney, herding societies are generally more violent than farming ones, because their wealth is mobile and hence more susceptible to theft. So you've got cattle rustling done with violence, inviting violent reprisals. You've got conflict-hardening tribal identities, as defined against an other, and a heightened role for military leaders and warriors. Per Anthony, victory in tribal warfare depended on forging alliances, allowing you to mobilize larger forces than your enemy. Successful chiefs who own large herds enhanced their ability to build alliances by throwing lavish funeral feasts with large-scale graveside sacrifices, mostly of domesticated cattle. They could also attract great warriors by granting gifts, typically gained through plunder. In tandem, those who loaned animals gained power over those who borrowed them, and those who sponsored feasts obligated their guests, arrangements sealed by binding verbal oaths. The wealth in the graves of DD2 chiefs reflects this new trajectory, while the burial of children with similar hoards indicate that wealth and power had now become inheritable. Per the author, a broadly consistent set of regalia, including belts, beads, pendants, caps, plates, bracelets, and rings, was soon adopted by elites all across the Pontic-Caspian Steppe. And just like in Sumer and in Egypt, a potent symbol took the stage to mark this violent turn, with several DD2 graves holding polished stone mace heads. To the east of the DD2 culture, in the early 5th millennium BC, the Khvalynsk culture made its home in the middle Volga River. Per Anthony, while the two tribes had many similarities, the Khvalynsk treated their dead a bit differently. Instead of using communal graves, they used separate graves for families or individuals. And for graveside sacrifices, in addition to domesticated sheep and cattle, they also used a local animal, one common to the steppe, but virtually unknown anywhere else in the contemporary world. It was called let me check my notes here, yes, a horse. Per the author, in 5000 BC, more than 40% of the world's horse population lived in the Eurasian steppe, with the remainder split among isolated pockets in Europe, Anatolia, and Transcaucasia, the region just south of the Caucasus. Horses were rare or entirely absent in the Near East, Iran, and the Indian subcontinent. Since they were the most common large wild grazing animals in the steppe, horse meat made up a significant portion of the hunter-gatherer diet. Being large, skittish, and aggressive, horses were typically hunted in groups, with the goal of driving them into ravines where they could be killed en masse. Per Anthony, intimate familiarity with horses makes it likely that the Eurasian steppe was where the horse was first domesticated. In fact, the animals sacrificed at Khvalynsk burials may be the earliest known domesticated horses. Domestication does not imply riding, which came along a bit later. Instead, horses were initially domesticated as a source of meat for the brutally cold steppe winters. In contrast to domesticated sheep and cattle, which are largely unsuited to such conditions, horses will forage for food even under thick blankets of snow and use their hooves to break through ice to reach water. In fact, as winters grew colder in the latter part of the 5th millennium BC, horses likely thrived while cattle and sheep died off. Early domestication of horses required both knowledge and luck. Per the author, familiarity would have taught steppe peoples that herds can be most easily led by controlling the dominant female. But breeding a domesticated line of horses required something much more rare, a docile male. Stallions are notoriously willful, and identifying and capturing a docile stallion to breed, and thereby pass down docile traits, was the critical act that made horse domestication feasible. After this breakthrough, keeping horse herds as a winter food source became increasingly common, particularly in the Caspian Steppe, the region north of the Caspian Sea. Interestingly, to paraphrase director Krennic from Andor, it turns out that horses are not the most unique thing about the Khvalynsk. Per Spinney, the bodies of several Khvalynsk chiefs were adorned with crude metal ornaments, crafted from hammered sheets of copper and shaped by local chisels made of beaver teeth set into bone handles. While the craftsmanship was clearly local, the copper was definitely not. In fact, it's been traced to a site in the Danube Plain abutting the Black Sea coast, a very famous and important site called Varna. Per Anthony, after crossing the Dardanelles, some Anatolian farmer herders had settled along the Black Sea coast and Carpathian Balkan interior, the modern territories of Bulgaria and southern Romania. Between around 5200 and 5000 BC, the scattered farming hamlets of this region coalesced into huge, well-organized agricultural villages, surrounded by cleared and cultivated land, along with herds of domesticated cattle, pigs, and sheep. Local homes were made of timber and mud plaster, and were typically spacious, multi-room, and often multi-story. The region soon boasted thousands of such villages, each containing thousands of dwellings and housing tens of thousands of people. The culture, conventionally known as Old Europe, showed little evidence of hierarchy, wealth inequality, or widespread conflict, and no evidence of any village or region dominating its neighbors. Judging by the popularity of broad-hipped clay female figurines, it's been speculated that Old Europe may have been matriarchal. It's also worth highlighting that this same period, 5200 to 5000 BC, happened to be the exact same time that violent patriarchal cattle-rustling steppe chiefdoms became the default paradigm across the Pontic-Caspian Steppe. So, ... foreshadow, and possible spoiler alert. Per Philip L. Cole, from origins in Mesopotamia and Anatolia, the spread of metallurgical knowledge followed the general spread of farming and herding. But it wasn't until the villages of Old Europe that metalworking really took off. Per Anthony, the main innovation was when Balkan smiths learned to fashion molds that could withstand the heat of molten copper. By 4500 BC, well-made cast copper tools and weapons were being used and exchanged all across southeastern Europe. Per Spinney, the copper ore that was used at Varna came from mines in the Balkan interior. The locals also panned for gold, likely using fleeces, which was later brought to the settlement as grains or nuggets. Once at Varna, the metals were worked by a skilled community of smiths, metallurgists, casters, and charcoal burners, among the earliest evidence of craft specialization in human history. Around Lake Varna alone, 8 settlements accommodated such communities, each with nearly 1,000 inhabitants. But it was outside the settlements, beyond the fields and grazing herds, that excavators found proof of Varna's enormous wealth. Per Anthony, the Varna cemetery laid claim to the most ostentatious burials in the world, far richer than anything in the contemporary Near East, with bodies interred with painted ceramics and finely crafted items of copper and gold. To loop us back to where we began, how did the Khvalynsk steppe chiefs of the Volga River get a hold of Varna copper? Very likely with their own 2 feet. Chiefs were always on the lookout for exotic items to adorn themselves and gift their greatest warriors. And per Spinney, the journey from Varna to the Khvalynsk Volga takes roughly a month by foot, which is a bit of a trek, but certainly manageable. Alternately, chiefs could have made the journey by dugout canoe, hugging close to the Black Sea coast, at least in the relatively calm seas of the brief summer season. Per the author, whatever the chiefs exchanged for the copper was most likely perishable, and may have included animal skins, cured meats, and plants with medicinal or recreational properties. Once the trade became established, copper may have passed through a chain of intermediaries, each of whom only traveled a fairly short distance. And you may want to sit down for this next part. Per the author, many linguists agree that the mother tongue of one partner in this trading network, couriers from Trabzon or Colchis, or steppe herders along the Volga or Don, was likely an ancestor of Indo-European. So, to get into truly mind-blowing territory, this mid-5th millennium BC language may have given rise to the family of languages now spoken by nearly every second person on the face of the earth. I need to go walk around a bit to work off this excitement. You guys take a few minutes to process, and I'll be back with more. In the late 5th millennium BC, the farming-herding Cucutaini-Tripolye culture, or CTC, still occupied the western portions of the Eurasian steppe. The CTC's eastern neighbors were now the Sredny Stog culture, who'd likely originated near the Volga River before migrating west toward the Dnieper. Like their previous neighbors, the Khvalynsk culture, the Sredny Stog were obsessed with horses, even carving their polished mace heads to look like horse heads. While continuing the Dnieper-Donetsk II practice of single grave burials for high-status members, Sredny Stog graves included a new surface feature, a low earthen mound surrounded by a small circle of stones. These were likely the very first kurgans known to the Northern Steppe. Per Spinney, the late 5th millennium BC saw the increased appearance of similar kurgans in the lands approaching Old Europe. The mixed ancestry of the grave's inhabitants suggests that early steppe emissaries found local imitators who acted as middlemen in the copper trade, or local wives they had children with who eventually took up that role. Between Old Europe and the Sredny Stog sat our friends in the CTC. In fact, at the time, the CTC's Sredny Stog frontier was the major contact zone between matriarchal, egalitarian, sedentary, metalworking farming society and patriarchal, hierarchical, nomadic, cattle-herding, metal-loving steppe society. But it seems that at this particular frontier, mutual dependence outweighed mutual hostility. Per Anthony, the presence of Sredny Stog items at CTC sites shows some degree of interaction, and a lack of evidence of major conflict suggests an understanding, possibly trade agreements, formal alliances, maybe even intermarriage. But if the CTC were effectively off-limits, a new technology enabled steppe tribes to raid much further afield. Imagine being the very first person to try to ride a horse. I doubt it was the result of rigorous theorizing and elaborate Da Vinci-type diagrams. No, it likely came down to a bit too much fermented mare's milk and a forceful dare. All we really know is this. Whoever it was, and whenever it happened, the act inaugurated the fastest and most widely adopted mode of overland human transport for the next 6,000 years. So, likely drunken teenager of the past, we salute you. Following this breakthrough, the concept of horse riding spread rapidly across the Eurasian steppe. At first, it was seen as a useful tool for managing larger herds. But given the nature of steppe society, the new technology was soon employed for cattle rustling and intertribal conflict. Though horses were ridden to and from battles, those battles weren't fought on horseback. The cultural package that'd make cavalry viable, in terms of both technology and martial philosophy, wouldn't develop for another 3,000 years. Basically, you'd need the short, recurved compound bow to swing over the horse's rear to make that Parthian shot, and you'd need disciplined soldiers who weren't so focused on attaining personal glory. But even at this early stage, horses gave riders a huge advantage in speed, range, and the critical element of surprise. And before too long, tribes started looking beyond the steppe for additional sources of plunder. The Sredny Stog were not only horse riders, but they were intimately familiar with Old Europe. In fact, steppe tribes mainly knew Old Europe as a source of copper and gold. They also knew that the region was abundant in marshland for wintering cattle, and that the locals had little experience with, or taste for, violent conflict. All of which, as you may surmise, made the region a tempting target. Then, in the late 5th millennium BC, climate change sweetened the deal. Per Spinney, around 4200 BC, conditions grew colder and drier in the Black Sea region. Grassy steppe encroached on forest, expanding grazing opportunities for herders. At the same time, the lack of rain caused crops to fail and rendered farming less tenable. And though we don't know all the details, archaeology shows that around this time, Old Europe experienced a major shock. Per Anthony, between around 4200 and 3900 BC, more than 600 settlements on the lower Danube and in eastern Bulgaria were burned and abandoned. Per Spinney, many show signs of extreme violence, of massacres that spared no man, woman, or child. It may have been partly farmer on farmer, as climate change inflamed social tensions within and between communities, leading to scapegoating and feuds. But the bulk of the evidence points to a different culprit. Per Anthony, the people who lived in the region soon after relied much less on farming than herding and owned domesticated horses. The Balkan mines fell into disuse, and metal production took a major nosedive, in both volume and technical skill. Ceramics and metal objects also changed notably in style. And despite zero affinity for clay female figurines, some new inhabitants were pretty partial to mace heads shaped like horse heads. For the Sredny Stog of the Dnieper River, horse riding may have presented the opportunity to circumvent their CTC neighbors, with whom they'd likely had alliances, in order to raid a more distant and lucrative target. The first such raids may have been small-scale, maybe a dozen or so steppe horsemen making off with a few dozen cattle. From those humble beginnings, the author envisions a growing, evolving, centuries-long cycle of raiding, cattle rustling, revenge killings, and general violent conflict. It was very likely this persistent warfare, paired with a period of increased cold, that led to the collapse of Old Europe. Next episode, we'll continue our discussion of steppe developments during the 3rd millennium BC. We'll cover the sudden explosion and sudden collapse of the CTC supertowns, reconnect with the mycop culture, and witness the fundamental changes wrought by the emergence of the first large wheeled vehicles on the Northern Steppe. And we'll meet the culture that perfected the nomadic steppe lifestyle, and also found the time to bequeath us many of the languages, myths, and social arrangements still prevalent in the world today. The Yamnaya horizon of the Pontic-Caspian Steppe. All this next time on The Ancient World. Would you like to listen to ad-free episodes of The Ancient World and a bunch of other great history podcasts? Then go to The Ancient World Podcast on Apple Podcasts and subscribe to Airwave History Plus. You'll get a free 7-day trial to listen to ad-free episodes, bonus content, and more from the largest collection of history podcasts anywhere. So subscribe to Airwave History Plus on Apple Podcasts today.